Welcome everyone to another week of our study, our continuing study of the Haftarot. This week we're reading Parashas Vayishlach and the Haftaros from Ovadia. But before we start, I want to point out a halacha that relates to this week's parasha, this week's Haftara. It's Simon Reish Pei Dalet in Orach Chaim, says the Mechaber, Maftirin bin Navi me'inyana shel parsha. Okay, no big surprise. The Haftara should be me'inyan ha-parsha. Ve'ein pochatin mechaf aleph psukim. You don't do a Haftara less than 21 psukim. Ela im kein slika inyana b'tzibur mehachi. It's a huge carve-out. You don't do a Haftara less than 21 psukim unless the Haftara you're doing has less than 21 psukim. So it's a little strange. I'm skipping to the Ramah, who quotes the Maram me Padua. The Ramah says, "V'davka b'Shabbos b'inyan chaf aleph psukim." We only need 21 psukim on Shabbos. Gimel psukim l'chol echad min hakruim. Right, that's where the makar comes from. 3 psukim for each aliyah. Therefore, he says, "Aval b'yom tov shekarin hey on yom tov when you only have 5 aliyos sagi b'tesvav psukim." So then you can have Haftara of only 15 psukim. What's fascinating is, okay, 21 is the minimum number, but 21 also seems to me, and this is an unscientific study, to be the optimal number. There seems to be a number of Haftaras that have exactly 21 psukim. And lo and behold, this week's Haftara has exactly 21 psukim. In fact, it turns out there are only 21 psukim in all of Sefer Ovadia. We're going to literally read the entirety of Sefer Ovadia this Shabbos, and it's only 21 psukim. So, as additional reward, if you do this week's Haftara, and somebody asks you after Shabbos, what do you do on Shabbos? Don't tell them you did the Haftara of Vayishlach. Tell them you did all of Sefer Ovadia. It sounds like more fun, and it's worth it. Okay. Let's see. The questions we've dealt with, and the question we're going to deal with is, when you come to Haftara, like from a Sefer like Ovadia, from a Sefer like Hosea, from a Sefer like Malachi, the last 2 weeks, is who is Ovadia, and who is Hosea, and who is Malachi. The question actually matters much less this week, because the Haftara can be read as a timeless Haftara. It's sort of a Haftara that criticizes Edom whenever and wherever. So I don't think it's that critical, but as it happens, Chazal have opinions. One opinion is that Ovadia comes from the time of Sefer Malachim Aleph. He's a Talmud of Eliyahu. In the story of Eliyahu and the king, the pasuk says, "Vayikra achav el Ovadyahu asher al habayit, v'Ovadyahu haya yareh et Hashem ma'od." Okay, Ovadyahu was a frum guy. The Radak, I think it's the Radak, says right there, that would be, if Ovadia was a Navi, it would be an insult to call him Yareh et Hashem, because that's less than a Navi. Okay, so take it or leave it. Another fascinating suggestion in the Gemara in Sanhedrin is that Ovadia is a ger from Edom, which would, really be interesting to us, because the whole Haftara deals with Edom. Okay, so that's just in terms of who he is. But who he is less important. And now that you know that he wrote all of 21 psukim, and many of them parallel other Nevi'im, it's less important. But the bigger question is, right, what's the connection between the Parsha and the Haftara? And here too, it's so obvious as to not be a serious question, except when you look at it more closely, right? The tension between Yaakov and Esav is really important in our parsha. The whole reunion, so to speak, is crucial in our parsha. And so therefore, the idea that you're going to read a Haftara about Edom makes complete sense. But usually, we understand what happens in our parsha very well, and we use that to understand the Haftara. Here, I think it actually works in an opposite direction. The Haftara forces us to revisit the Parsha and to revisit what is really unresolved in the Torah, and that is, what is the relationship between Yaakov and Esav? Right? Yaakov was away for 22 years in the house of Lavan. Okay, and now, at the beginning of the Parsha, he's concerned, maybe even panicked, about Esav coming, V'arba me'ot ish imo, right? It sounds like Esav is still angry at Yaakov. And, the last interaction they had was when Yaakov, stole the brachot. We can, just explain it all different ways, but more or less, that's what happened. And Yaakov is worried. Will Esav treat him as a brother or as an enemy? And the parasha begins, Vayishlach Yaakov malachim lefonav el Esav achiv. Esav, his brother, Artzos seir sidei Edom. Meaning, Yaakov's hope certainly was that Esav would be his brother. And it seems in the story, and it seems after the story, that Esav reciprocates that feeling, right? The pasuk says, Vayomer Esav yesh li rav, achi yehi lecha ashalach. I have a lot. My brother, keep what you have, meaning you give me all these presents, you're offering me all these things. I don't need any of them. And so when you go back to the key moment, and I asked myself this question unrelated to the Haftara, which is, what was Esav's plan? Meaning Yaakov hoped that they could, become brothers again. What was Esav's plan? So you don't know. So one possibility is, Esav always planned to hug Yaakov and to kiss him, and that's what happened. The other possibility, which Chazal raise, is that Vayishlach, I think there's some Yiddish phrase, im pinkalach, or something like that. Im Resh says nikudot, with the dots over the word Vayishlach, make it clear that he didn't do it with a whole heart. But Lamaisa, he did it. And not only that, in the conclusion of the story, Esav seems to want to go with Yaakov. And Yaakov is doing every single thing he can to get away from Esav. In a way, Esav seems much more brotherly to Yaakov than Yaakov seems to Esav. And so that's, when you ask yourself the question, were they going to be brothers? Were they going to be enemies? The sense you get when you read it is that Esav would have been happy for them to be brothers. And if anything, it was Yaakov who was reticent for that to happen. But that's just a speculation right now. But then you come, after the story, there's like an interlude, the story of Dinah and Shechem and all those bad things. You come to Parak Lamed Vav in our Parsha, and the Parsha begins, Ve'ela toldot Esav hu Edom. So right away, because the Haftara doesn't use the word Esav, the Torah made it absolutely clear. Esav is Edom. Now, what does that say about Esav? Does it say he's no longer Yaakov's brother? Is it Yaakov Achi or Edom, or is it something else? Then we continue reading, and you're kind of surprised by these psukim. The Torah says, Vayikach Esav et nashav ve'et banav ve'et benotav ve'et kol nafshot beito ve'et mikneu ve'et kol behemto ve'et kol kinyano asher achash be'eretz Canaan vayelech el eretz mipnei Yaakov achiv. He abandoned Eretz Yisrael because of Yaakov. And the pasuk, which, convincing or not, Ki ayarechu sham rav mishevet yachdav v'lo yachla eretz migurhem lo seito tam mipnei miknehem. They simply had too much cattle, right? It reminds you very much of Abraham and Lot, but Lot didn't leave Eretz Yisrael. Lot just went to Sodom. Right here, Esav left, and Vayeshev Esav b'har seir, Esav hu Edom. That same pasuk again. Going forward, Esav is Edom. He's not Esav. He's not Yaakov's bracha. He's somebody else completely. So first of all, I think just an obvious question is, Ki hayarechu sham rav mishav yachdav. The land of Israel couldn't support both Yaakov and Esav? It's hard to imagine. Esav had so much cattle, Yaakov had so much cattle, that the entirety of the land of Israel couldn't support them? It's hard to know. And that's why, Rav Moshe Lichtenstein suggests, at least, that at some point, and it's interesting to think this way, Yaakov went to Lavan. He ran away from Esav. He went for a year, 2 years, 3 years. Right? At some point, Esav thinks to himself, you know what? Yaakov may have found a life in Padan Aram. Yaakov married a bunch of women there. He had children, right? That's where he's going to live. It's 22 years. He's never coming back. And now Yaakov comes back. And that option that Esav is going to inherit Eretz Yisrael is foreclosed to him. And Esav basically says to himself, well, if it's true now, after 22 years, that Yaakov is restating his claim to Eretz Yisrael, and clearly Yaakov is restating his claim to Eretz Yisrael, so Esav moves to Edom. He takes on a new identity. And, it's not as strange as we would think. The prophecy to Yaakov that he was inheriting was, your children are going to be geirim ba'aretz. They're going to be foreigners for 400 years. 400 years is a long time. If somebody said to you or me, oh, you could have a great thing happen to you after 400 years, that's, a great. I'm never going to see that. So Esav may have said to himself, okay, that's fine. And therefore, Esav hu Edom. And that might explain the repetition of the pasuk, right? He's no longer Esav achi Yaakov. He's no longer Esav ben Yitzchak. He's Esav hu Edom. And therefore we find Vayeshev Yaakov, beginning of next week's parasha, Be'eretz migurei aviv be'eretz Kinaan, Eile toldot Yaakov, Yosef ben Shva, Shana, etc., etc. As opposed to Vayeshev Esav Bahar Seir, Esav hu Edom, that same line, Ve'eile toldot Esav avi Edom Bahar Seir. He's left. He's no longer his brother. He's no longer the son. He's gone to a different team. He was traded to a different team. No more loyalty. He's a free agent, and this is the split. Okay, so on some way you say, "Wow, Esav, what an idiot! Why didn't he just take Eretz Yisrael?" And the answer is, well, he lost out on the bracha, and Yaakov returned, and he looked at the odds and looked at what's going on. And he said, "Okay, I have to leave." So he left. Now we come to the Haftara, back to Ovadia. The first part of our Haftara treats Edom kind of like any of the Gentile nations. He's arrogant, he's wrong, he thinks too much of himself. The Haftara begins, Chazon Ovadia, Ko Amar Adonai Elohim Ladom, Shema Shamanu Me'et Adonai V'tzir Bagayim Shulach, Kumu V'nakumu Ala La Milchama. Edom, wants to go to war, and now the Navi begins in a mean way. Hine katonet taticha bagayim bazui atamaod. You are the smallest of all the nations. You're the most disrespected. Zidon libcha hi shochni bechag ve'salam barom shifto omer bilibo mi yorideni aretz. Right? You say to yourself, I'm a great nation. I'm a great people. Who can possibly bring me down? Im tagbia kanesher v'im ben kochavim simkinecha misham oridcha nu'um Adonai. Says God, no. Even if you become a bird, even if you make your palaces and your castles on top of trees, says God, misham oridcha, I will bring you down. Okay, so there is the sense that Edom is like all other nations, and that God is going to bring them down like you find with respect to other nations. But the Haftara takes a turn. Pasuk Yud Aleph seems like it moves on to a new theme. And the theme is, and I'll read it to you, Pasuk Yud Aleph says, Biyom amodcha mineged, biyom shavot sarim chelo v'nachrim bo sha'arav, v'al Yerushalayim yadu goral, gam ata ka'achad mehem. When all the nations, I'm paraphrasing now, stood around and watched the destruction of Yerushalayim and the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash, says God, you were amongst them. You watched. The implication is, you're his brother. You should have helped. Va'al teira biyom achicha biyom nachro. Va'al tismach livnei Yehuda biyom abdam. Va'al tagdel picha biyom tzara. Right? You didn't help. It was your brother. You didn't get involved at all. The sense you get from Yud Aleph and on, or for a few psukim after Yud Aleph, is that Edom is not just a regular nation. Edom has more of an obligation to Yaakov Avinu than we would have otherwise thought. Edom is Achi Yaakov. They're brothers. And so you have both themes. You have the theme of Esav hu Edom, he is left. He's become a new nation. He's renounced his claim to Eretz Israel. He's renounced his claim to the brachot or anything he had beforehand. He's become a new nation. But here, the Psukim seem to blame Esav because we know, right? You can't really renounce a blood relationship. It's a fact. And so the Haftara continues, V'haya Beit Yaakov, this is a nevuah that Rashi quotes. V'haya Beit Yaakov Eish, Ubeit Yosef Lehava, Ubeit Esav Lekash. Right? When Rashi said, when the Torah says that Yaakov, after Yosef was born, said to his wives, let's leave and go home. So Rashi says, yeah, of course you could go home because Yosef was born and Veis Esav Lekash, V'dal Kubohem V'achalum, V'lo Yiyes Sarid Lebeit Esav, Ki Hashem Diber. Right? Says God, ultimately, the house of Esav is a straw house, and the base of Yaakov is a fire, and the base of Yosef is a flame, and it will destroy and eat up completely, and there will not be any remnant of Esav left. Okay, so that's a significant point, and more or less, that's the summary of our Haftarah. But what does it mean for us? Right? I've made the case before, and I believe it to be true, that Haftarahs are like Me'ein HaMa'ora, meaning the idea of the Haftarah is current events. You learn a piece of Navi, and you relate it to something that's going on in your world. So what's the message for us? So first of all, luckily, Chazal made clear, not only is Esav who Edom, but Edom who Romi. Edom is Rome. Or in other words, Edom is the church. And our relationship with the church continues to this day, and it's been a difficult one. When I was a kid, the phrase, Judeo-Christian heritage was pretty popular. You heard it all the time. Now you don't really hear it. And, there are some Jews, and I'm not knocking it, who believe in and love, interfaith dialogue. Let's talk to other religions, let's share ideas, let's be complimented by them. But the question is, to what end? Presumably, when the church announced that the Jews were no longer responsible for killing Jesus, that was a big step. Probably that may have saved Jewish lives, it's hard to know. But what else is there? What could they tell us now that would make us feel better about them? My sense, at least, is that the desire to hear a good word from the church about the Jews stems in part from a lack of self-confidence that we have. Of course, Pope Leo, the new Pope, believes in a two-state solution. Why shouldn't he? He's not invested in Judaism. What else should we expect? I'm reminded of what the Rav Zatzal said in his famous essay. I think it's the first essay he wrote in English in 1964. It's called Confrontation. And it deals with our relationship with Christianity in specific. And said the Rav, and here's the quote, therefore, any intimation, overt or covert, on the part of the community of the many is the church, that it is expected of the community of the few, that's us, that it shed its uniqueness and cease existing because it has fulfilled its mission by paving the way for the community of the many, must be rejected as undemocratic and contravening the very idea of religious freedom. Meaning the idea that we played a role in history and then we were replaced, various Jews, right? Then we were replaced by the real Jews, meaning the Christians. Said the Rav, there's nothing to talk about. And the Rav's idea was, you can't have dialogue on religious issues with other religions because we believe different things. We believe the game started in a different place, the game will end in a different place. And that's significant. We need to have confidence in who we are and in our unique mission. And we have to believe with our whole hearts that the conclusion of the Haftara will occur. Namely, Va'alu Moshim b'Haretzion et Esav v'Hisal la'Adonai ha'melucha. That's the end of the story. We're going to get the last word. Is our Haftara lechatchila? Do we want to destroy Esav? I don't think so. We could debate it. I'm not convinced. Probably would be better if Edom supported our claim. If Edom supported our historical destiny. If the church supported our historical destiny, it would probably be better. But with or without their support, it's going to happen. Now, if you permit me, just one personal comment. Years ago, our youngest daughter, Malka, was born this week. And we wanted to name her Malka because both my grandmother and my wife's grandmother had that name. But then we were looking for a middle name. And we came across the Haftara. And I didn't have a deep understanding of the Haftara, but I could read. And my daughter's name is Malka Tziona, after the last pasuk in the Haftara. And if I believed all those years ago, when things frankly were better for Jews were much more popular. There was a peace process. People loved the Jews back then. And anti-Semitism was unacceptable in proper company. In the world we live in, people don't love the Jews. And anti-Semitism is completely acceptable in proper company. And nevertheless, I believe more now than I did then, that one day, Vayishlach Esav, Vayishlach Shabbat Shalom.